we're going to push this pawn on to b3. And some of you might be saying, wait a second, you're making this pawn easier to capture. Now he can walk his king to c3 and take it. And that's exactly what he's going to do. And that's exactly the point, because by taking it, he allows us to transition to a pawn endgame where not only we're up a pawn, but additionally his king is all the way over there. So we can open up the center and bring our own king into the king's side. That's a lot of moving parts. So what would be the best move here? Well, we can play e5 immediately, but there is a bit of a complex reason, guys, that e5 is not the best move. Filecki from Poland, let's go e4. And my guess is he'll play e5. Yeah, let's go d4. And will he take the pawn? Will he be our first Danish gambit victim? Oh, he will not be. So d6 is not a bad move, and we talked about this move earlier, where essentially we can take on e5, and some people might be really attracted to the possibility of making black lose his castling rights. But remember, as I've said last time, when you trade queens, losing castling rights is less effective. It's less meaningful. It's still meaningful, but it's less meaningful. So instead of that, let's transpose into the Philidor with knight f3. All right? Philidor is still very good for white, and it preserves the queens. We're trying to play aggressively. So when possible, we're avoiding endgames. f6. Okay. So that's, again, you can see how often people make the mistake of playing f3 or f6. So Feingold's advice exists for a reason. And here we should immediately understand the drawback of f6. It weakens this diagonal. That's its main problem. It also weakens this diagonal. And so we should exploit the first of these by getting the bishop out to c4. That's it. That makes it very hard for black to castle. So already his position is very tough. And I'm assuming he's going to play bishop g4. Thank you, Alexander. I appreciate it. All right, so in this position, there are many ways of developing our pieces, right? The typical move, I suppose, would be knight c3. But after knight c3, bishop g4, this pawn on d4 will be under quite a bit of pressure, and I'm not a big fan of that. So one very good way of playing in these positions, well, exploiting the fact that we haven't gotten our knight out yet. We could play h3, that's fine. h3 is a great move. Scan 1459, thank you for the prime. But also, how can we support this pawn in the most direct way? Bishop g8 I'll explain after the game. c3, yeah. I will explain the alternatives and why I didn't play them afterwards, including bishop g8 and d5. a5. All right, so one of the great things about c3, it defends the pawn, but that's not the only thing it does. It also opens up a pathway for this queen to come to b3. But if we do that immediately, if we play queen b3 in this position, attacking the knight, what does black have? And this move a5, from that perspective, is actually kind of ingenious. He can play the move a4, attacking the queen, forcing it to move. So let's actually play a4 ourselves to prevent him from doing that, because I'm trying to pave the way for queen b3. That might end up in very quick checkmate, assuming that he plays something like b6 or something. I don't know what he'll do. But, okay, knight h6. So, whoa, there, he's giving us an all-you-can-eat buffet here. Is bishop takes h6 a good idea? That's the first and most obvious question that we have to answer. Let me be very clear. The reason that it's a good idea is not because black will have doubled h-pawns. It's because the king on e8 is going to be a lot easier to access, because the pawn structure around the king is going to be ruined. There's one particular thing that's going to be the easiest of all to access, and that is the h5 square. A potential check on h5 with the queen will no longer, black will no longer have as a response the move g7 to g6, and that is crucial. So we have to think about where we put this knight to pave the way for queen h5, and ideally we would choose the knight move that yields the most benefit. What does that mean? Well, we can approach this a couple of different ways. We don't have a particularly appetizing knight move with tempo. You can sacrifice on e5, but that leads to some complications. I'll talk about them after the game. I don't find that move particularly convincing. Barring that, we can put the knight on a square where the knight itself will later be able to come into the attack. So not knight g1, not knight d2, but rather knight h4, and you'll see this very often. This knight can later come into the game with knight f5, right? I hope that logic makes sense. We could have also gone queen b3 and tried to stick a bishop on f7, but that would have been less clinical. And now black is in massive trouble. He's actually inviting our queen to h5. King e7 will get checkmated in one move. He's got to play king d7 here. All right, king g, he does. Now here, there's two ways to go about it. If you've done your puzzles, you'll notice the relationship here between the queen and the rook results in the possibility of what move? Yeah, we can go knight g6. And that's a sort of materialistic approach. There's nothing wrong with that. We can win the exchange. That's fine. But, you know, with the white pieces, we're going instead for the more direct attacking options. Queen f7 check is super, super tempting. But he blocks with the queen, and by blocking with the queen, listen carefully. So these things can be hard to follow, so you really want to be locked in here. After queen f7, queen e7, his king has access to this escape square on d8. We don't want to let him have that. So instead, if we're patient, we can notice that this h4 knight now can come into f5, and the bishop on c8 is no longer able to take it. So let's bring the knight in with knight f5. Thank you, Andrew Exalted, for the tier 1. Notice how I've done this twice now. I'm patiently bringing pieces into the attack when I don't have an immediate path to checkmate. And these kinds of moves are what elude a lot of beginners, a lot of players who struggle with finishing people off in these attacking positions. That's what they really struggle with, is these patient moves. All right, so queen e8 is a great thought because he wants to trade queens, but we have now 3 pieces in the attack, and we can use one of them to send black away. Then we have a very pretty pattern. Boom. Bishop f7, get out of there. Now, after queen d8, my logic indicates 2 things. First of all, look at his king carefully. When the king doesn't have any more squares to escape, that's the moment that you should start explicitly and directly looking for checkmating patterns and checkmating tactics. And the way you should do that is by considering from what squares checkmate could be delivered. Not only squares that are currently protected, because you could set up a move, right? If you look at that, well, what squares could we checkmate the king from? One of them is e6. Bishop e6 would be checkmate, but that square is not currently protected. But the pawn, we can push it. We attack the knight, but mainly we threaten bishop e6 checkmate. He's probably going to go knight e7, but it doesn't matter where he puts the knight. He actually can't stop it. Yeah, bishop e6. I mean, that's a very pretty mate. Look at how our 3 pieces are beautifully cooperating, and a 4th piece, the pawn, is guarding one of the escape squares simultaneously, acting as the anchor to the bishop. That was really nice. And we're over 1,000. Yay. Okay, so first of all, why is this? So this isn't bad. This is not bad. X1, please stop spamming the same question. Yes, it is. This is not bad. White is slightly better here. But without explaining any variations, the fact of the matter is that when you trade queens, it's just harder to attack the king. And so when black loses castling rights, it's less meaningful because oftentimes in the endgame, the king wants to enter the game through the center anyway. And black has this way of perching the king on c7 with c6 and king c7 that often hides it from the immediate danger of a check on d1. Hopefully that makes sense. We're not going to look at the lines here. Knight f3 transposes into the Philidor, and f6 is a pretty bad move. Okay, bishop c4, knight c6. Now this move c3, I explained, a5, a4. Now what I mean here is queen b3, a4, attacks the queen. We can give a check on f7, and if he goes king d7, queen e6 is checkmate, but unfortunately he goes king e7, and now we're in trouble, because this battery is really frayed by the fact that the queen is attacked. And after queen d5, black has kind of a sexy move here to attack the queen. Can you guys spot it? Thank you, Ozzy Demand. Why is c3 better than bishop e3? Yeah. So he justifies pushing that pawn. So there was a question about why c3 is better than bishop e3. And I always repeat this Don't be shy about asking questions. That's what makes this, I think, even better. So bishop e3. This doesn't follow the principle that you should do stuff with the least valuable piece when possible. Pawns are best defended by other pawns because that builds pawn chains, and that's the most solid kind of pawn structure construction. Thank you, Randog, for the gift of Ossier. In addition, it prepares queen b3, so this just does more. Okay, so a4. Knight h6. Here we take it. And here I thought people were a little bit flustered. You know, why didn't we make a more active move with the knight? Well, I can't answer that question. R3 knight with a prime. So first of all, knight g5. The problem that you're going to run into here is that there is simply no checkmate. There is simply no checkmate. I mean, this is the same position in the game, except we had a knight on h4. So that doesn't work. And knight takes c5 comes closer to working. Remember this pattern. If he plays f takes e5, there's something in Puzzle Rush that's very similar to this. There is a puzzle that's super similar and has the same pattern. After queen h5, king d7, white has a checkmate in 2 moves. Can you guys spot it? This can be hard to find. It's a weird... There's something weird about it that makes it hard to see. Yeah, it's the lateral check, queen f5. And wherever the king goes, you're mate him on f7. So that construction happens pretty often. The problem is black can play d takes e5. Uh-oh, why is that 94? 5, give it to damn girl. And Magon with 100 bits. Oh, man, thank you, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. The problem here is that even king e7 is not that easy to put down because the king now has the d6 square. And king d7 is even better because here black can block the check kind of like he would in the game. So be very careful. Remember, one sec. Right, okay. So remember the thing about sacrificing is that when you watch like me play or something, you might think that sacrificing is some sort of obligatory component of an attack, but it's really not. Some of the nicest attacks are ones that don't feature any sacrifices, but rather feature these moves which are crystal clear in their logic, such as getting the knight involved and preparing queen h5. So yeah, so somebody asked, so the same pattern here, right? Black goes queen e7, and now black has the d8 square for risking, so this just doesn't work. Thank you, Velocimantis, for the 1200. Okay, so knight h4, h5 takes. Now this move, knight f5. And that is the best move. Like, according to the engine, or at least one of the best, right? It's top move right now. So the engine really likes these moves, these slow moves that bring the queen into the game. Queen e8. Now bishop f7, and now the key move, of course, is d5. Right? Attacking the knight, but mainly preparing checkmate on e6. This was a very straightforward attack. One which featured 3 pieces. It abides by the 2-piece rule. Most attacks, I think, you know, you basically need a minimum of 2 pieces in it to attack successfully in most positions. That's not a particularly meaningful rule, but that's just something that you can kind of use to remind yourself that you want to bring pieces into the attack. Why not queen f5 instead of knight f5? Because that is a check which allows the king to drop back to e. Remember that compared to the position we were talking about previously, there is a pawn on f6. Method of comparison. Queen can't go to f7. You have to basically repeat moves here. All right. So how should black have defended against this? Well, after knight h4, he's basically lost. But if I were playing black here, I would have played the move queen to e7. And the point is to vacate the d8 square for the king. At the very least, black is still in the game, although this position, as you can just see visually, is miserable. All right. Now I mentioned the move knight g6 here. That would have been possible. You can win material that way. But we were going for the much greater prize of delivering checkmate. Would you consider bishop takes g8? Last question here. Would you consider bishop takes g8? So that's a good thought because black can no longer castle, right? Because the rook has moved. However, that is a very valuable bishop. I would not consider this reason enough to give up the bishop. Because the bishop is a very valuable attacker. I hope that makes sense. In addition, black can even castle long at some point later. Or he can keep his king in the center. That's not always that bad. So I wouldn't do that. I would say that that's just not worth it. Anybody have any other questions about this game? Well, Florenstar, it's not nuts. The logic here is that you're doing it for a reason. You're doing it in order to deprive black of the ability to castle. But you're also correct that it's a very big commit. It's really committal to do something like this. Thank you, Chris. Should we accept the center game? Yes, you should. If you're playing black, you should accept it, and made fine, I think, for the prime. And I am working slowly, but I'm working on a course on refuting these various gambits. When can the rule F6 be broken? So these kinds of questions I can't answer generally, because that's the nature of exceptions to rules, is that they're concrete. So there has to be some sort of greater reason to play F6 or F3. And sometimes that reason is that it doesn't weaken the king that much, right? Like sometimes you're already castled or the king is on H1, and there's a bigger reason to play F3. If you're castled on the other side, then F3, the consequences of F3 are far less significant, and their benefits are often far more pronounced. All right. Let's play one more, guys. That 5 gifted subs put me over the edge. I'm going to play one more. I'm really enjoying this. I think we're having a great time. I'm having a great time. And, oh my lands, girl. Let's go. Alright, black against Sartho P from India. Let's play another card. Thank you, Zefka. Good to see you. And he plays the hillbilly, bishop c4. We faced this once before. This comes from people sometimes playing bishop c4 against everything. Against the Caro-Kann, it makes very little sense, because we play d5 with tempo. And he takes, we take. He's probably going to give a check, yes. Now, he's moving the same piece a bunch of times. Here, knight c6 is fine. Bishop d7 is also fine. It really doesn't matter. Both moves are about equivalent. But we're playing very solid chess, so to emphasize the notion that you shouldn't move a piece a bunch of times and trade it for a piece that's only moved once, we're going to play bishop d7. Well, chat is always chill. We're great. All right. So this is good. Okay, knight c3. So that's another slightly odd move. Some of you may be attracted to the possibility of d4, but we're not going to do that just yet, because he'll take the bishop with check. I'm a little bit worried that that pawn on d4 is going to become weak later in the game. Let's focus instead on developing. We can take his bishop, and I think that maybe some of you are concerned about taking the bishop because, ooh, his knight will appear on b5. But that knight is right about as innocuous as a snowflake that appears on my elbow. Like, you don't need to brush it off. You can brush it off if you want to. You can play a6. But a single knight on your side of the board, I think we have the subconscious association, right, where as soon as a piece appears on your side of the board, you start to get intimidated. But remember that you start with a lot of pieces. If you keep your position solid, a single knight or a single queen that appears on h5 is not usually going to be the end of the world. In fact, you can use it to your advantage, because you can attack it easily and make improving moves with tempo. His connection seems okay, according to the bars. He takes. And to emphasize this concept, right, a lot of people will play a6. a6 is a great move, but let's refrain from a6 for the time being. Let's just develop as if nothing is going on, because nothing is going on. So we're just going to go knight c6. We could also go knight f6. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, knight c6, knight f6 are equivalent. Yeah, I'll explain e5 afterward. e5 would have been fine, but not my preferred move. That's actually a very good teachable moment. So let me write this down, and I'll talk about it after the game. Okay, so c3. Okay. Now, the first thing I notice when this move is played is that the knight no longer has this square as a retreating square. So what move now becomes very timely? Yeah, now we play a6, right? Because if he goes knight d4, he ruins his pawn structure really badly. And that's, you know, when you have doubled pawns like that in the center, that's different, right? That doesn't, what I said before doesn't mean you want to seek out doubled pawns. Oh, yes, I got doubled pawns. Daniel told me that they don't matter. Double pawns do matter, particularly when they're in the center like that, and so that would be pretty significant positional concession. And yeah, they're also isolated, which makes them even worse. All right. Right, Plago, but our central control will be equivalent, so it's actually not that bad for white after knight d4. That's what he should play. Well, he might play. He probably will play knight a3. My guess is he'll play knight a3, but he seems to be the kind of player who might go to like a4 in this position. I don't know. I have a sense that you might do something crazy. That's like a fishing hook, whatever that's called, on the other side of the board. Doesn't make sense, of course. But we'll see. Why do all chess rules have to be so full of nuance? Oh, because chess itself is full of nuance. I'm sorry if you came here expecting things to be easy. Chess, as life, should be as full of nuance. Now, life has, for many, become devoid of nuance, but that's perhaps one of the biggest analogies. Knight d4. The rules themselves are very simple. All right, so knight d4. To his credit, he plays knight d4. We'll take it. And he's really, yeah, so takes on d4. Now we can play the move e6, or we can play the move knight f6. We can play them in any order. It really doesn't matter. I'm going to play e6 first. And I'll explain to you guys why in just a second, because we might want to develop this knight not to f6, but to e7. But there's two things to unpack. Knight e7 here would be bad, because it would block in the bishop. We can fianchetto the bishop, but I don't really see a reason to do that. Where should we put the bishop? Right, actually. Oh, that was sarcastic. Okay. Sorry, I didn't read the sarcasm. My bad. Yeah, bishop d6 is a really nice square. And now we have an ultimate plan of attacking this d4 pawn. Right, that seems to be a pretty obvious way to proceed, and we would do that with a knight, first and foremost, and perhaps with a queen from b6. But if we were to do that with a knight, then putting the knight on f6 isn't the greatest idea. We would put it on e7 so that the knight could later maneuver to one of these two squares and put pressure on d4. But first, let's castle. Let's not do that before we castle. All right. So our immediate plan here is to put more pressure on the pawn. Now, the question that players will all have, and this is not an easy topic, even I struggle with this, is what order do you do things in? Do you move the knight first, or do you move the queen first? And the only answer I have is you need to evaluate the sort of immediate benefits. Do either of these moves have other benefits other than what they're intended to do? And one of the moves does kind of have another benefit. Queen b6 sort of stops the bishop from developing, not fully, as I'll explain afterward, but it at least discourages the bishop from moving. Whereas, had we moved the knight first, he certainly could have moved the bishop out. He should still go bishop e3, maybe. No, because a3. All right, and now we can complete the plan. Where should we put the knight? Knight f5 or knight c6? Both moves are fine. But I like the concept. Knight f5 just seems a little bit more active. Just a tad, just a little more active. Although both moves are fine. Doesn't really matter. b4, no, he plays a really good, well, actually, no. So, okay. This is going to be a little hard to explain. Knight takes d4 is what we're probably going to play right now, because it wins the pawn. But I will say that in a real game, I probably would actually... Okay, let me try to explain this, okay? So knight takes d4 is a free pawn and black is better, but he goes bishop b2. He wants to go bishop b2, right? And everybody should understand that his bishop is going to be pretty good on that long diagonal. But if he plays bishop b2 in the presence of this pawn, then that bishop is going to be pretty terrible. So his bishop really has no good home. So what I'm actually going to propose here is that we don't take this pawn immediately, but instead focus on opening up the queen side in order to expose some of his other weaknesses. Because I feel like this will pay off more in the end than if we were to cash in by taking the pawn. How can we do that? Well, we can do that because he's played b4. This is a pretty committal move. It puts that pawn out. And we can now rip open the queen side. This move a5, right? This opens up a bunch of files. This will make a weakness on a3. And I'm happy that you guys are... It seems like you guys are understanding the logic here. Right? Where we might later take the pawn, but pawns aren't the greatest prize in chess. They're good. But this is a concept which, a lot of good players begin to fully master, which is this notion of being flexible, not always cashing in too soon. Bishop d2 is a really good move, though, by him. But now we're going to take the pawn, and he's going to take back. Yeah, thanks. All right. So he's found the best way to defend, actually, because if we take on b4, he will play the move rook to b1, and he will pin our bishop, and he will win our bishop. So we have to play in a better way. Now, a consequence of our last exchange is that the A file has opened up. And it seems pretty natural to battle for control of that A file. And if we play rook takes A1, we allow him to get control of the A file. We don't want that. We want control of the A file. And actually, this also might be a time to consider taking on d4. I actually think that now is a good time to take the pawn, because we have created an additional weakness on b4. He's going to have to divert some of his attention to its defense. So by taking on d4 now, we've opened up a second front, and he might not give us another opportunity to win the pawn. So you see how I'm like weighing these pros and cons. Now, if he goes bishop e3, I think some of you might be worried about that. What do we do? He actually might do that. What do we do in the event of bishop e3? Yeah, we can always take the knight with check. That's a crucial tactical detail. Yeah, we had to see that when taking the pawn. There was another move that I wanted to play initially here, which I'll explain afterward. This is a very hard question, like when do you take the pawn? When do you go for more? These questions don't have simple answers. Yeah, let me just write this down. Okay, so he takes. So we can play knight takes f3 check, but I honestly don't see the reason to do that. Let's take. There's no reason to take on f3 and get his queen active. Although we could. Thank you, Shiva. I appreciate that. Also, if he takes on d4, he gets our queen active. So we trade. We call it, Robert and I call this trading on your own terms. Trading on your own terms, getting him to be the one to take, as he does, and now our queen is centralized. Queen e2. What do we do? Yeah, so now we should take the pawn. There's no read. You know, we can go after this pawn, but rook a2 is also good. But you know what? Now that most pieces have been traded, and now that we have a specific pass pawn, let's not overthink this, and let's just take the pawn. 100 bits. Thank you, Magon83. The energy is palpable here. Oh my lands. Briggs digs with 5 gifted. Girl. And 200 from Curious Chimpanzee. And 300 from Duo Demon. Oh my god, what's going on here now? And 1 Scrooby with a prime. Alright. So, you guys want me to lose on time, don't you? Okay, so how should we go about winning this position? We're up 2 pawns. You know, we have a passer. Let's play the most flexible move first. And our ultimate goal would be to trade rooks here. Trading rooks will make it much easier for us to push this passer unobstructed. So how can we go about trading rooks here? Well, we have the idea of going rook a1. Let's not go rook a1 immediately. But we can cover that square with a queen and prepare rook a1. So queen c3 is a good place to do it from. So it doesn't ruin the activity of the queen. We could have also pushed the pawn. We also stop him from going rook c1. He's probably going to go rook b1. That would be a reasonable move. And then we're going to go rook a1 and force the queen trade, or the rook trade. Queen trade would be nice here too. So this is winning. It's not elementary. We have to be careful in any kind of endgame like this. Okay, so king g2. The one thing that I would notice here, folks, is the fact that our back rank is exposed. So we want to be very mindful of that as we're going about our business. And particularly, rook a1 might not be the best idea because he'll take, and then he'll slide his queen to c2. And that might create some unpleasant threats. I'll talk about that after the game. Now, we don't need to play g6 here, because if we play g6, then he plays rook b1, and then we're going to have a hard time pushing our pawn. So a middle ground here is to first push this pawn to b4, so that it's defended by the queen, and we're pushing the pawn. And then, depending on what he does, we'll either bring the king out or play h6 and make some luft, because the back rank is less exposed. Our rook is now on the back rank. That's why we're not trading rooks yet. And we're going to push the pawn to b4. It's defended by the queen. If he wants to play queen b2 and trade queens, great. We'll be happy with that. But then we're going to play h6 or g6 to get some lift for the king. And then we're, we can go without the rook. Okay, queen b2. Yeah, so obviously we trade. Now, we need to defend this pawn. Should we do it from a4 or should we do it from b8? Yeah. So, as the very famous endgame principle goes, rooks usually belong behind passed pawns. And the second endgame principle is, of course, that we need to involve our king. We don't want our king sitting there. So we're going to bring it in. We have a nice pathway. The third thing to remember is when you have rook endgames particularly, and you're up 2 pawns, one of the key ideas is to use this pawn as a decoy. What does that mean? And I'll explain a little bit more afterward. We have 2 minutes. We're going to push this pawn onto b3, and some of you might be saying, wait a second, you're making this pawn easier to capture. Now he can walk his king to c3 and take it. And that's exactly what he's going to do, and that's exactly the point, because by taking it, he allows us to transition to a pawn endgame where not only we're up a pawn, but additionally his king is all the way over there. So we can open up the center and bring our own king into the king's side. That's a lot of moving parts. So what would be the best move here? Well, we can play e5 immediately, but there is a bit of a complex reason, guys, that e5 is not the best move. And this is something I'll just have to show you after the game. We're going to go f6 instead to prepare it. There is sort of a very specific reason, because conceptually e5 is the best move, but he's got a defensive idea. So right now we're going to do something pretty clever. We're going to make a waiting move. I'm going to make a waiting. I really want him to capture on b3. So we're going to put him in Zugzwang until he either captures on b3 or moves his rook back, and he is in Zugzwang, or moves his king away, and then we're going to play e5. Okay, so he goes there. Now we're going to play e5 and open up the center. We're up a pawn in a pawn endgame. We're winning, and his king is too far away to defend his other 2 pawns. There are many ways to win this. The easiest is to get to these pawns and capture them one by one, and then we're going to have a bunch of extra pawns. So this guy was really good. I mean, I think his resistance was good. Now this pawn is further advanced, so let's drop the king away. And the red carpet is unrolled. We can just push it. And now we can checkmate with the queen. The fastest would be to make a second queen depending on where he goes. It actually doesn't matter, because he's... Yeah, so now we'll cut him off and then go king e3. Now there's plenty of resources on YouTube and stuff for learning these basic mates. I'm not going to go over them in too much depth. Basically, we mate the same way we do with the rook. We pursue the king until it reaches the corner, and then we checkmate it with the queen. All right. That guy made it to the endgame. Good game. All right. The server restarts in 7 minutes, so let's dig in. Now, the first moment at which people had questions is this move, e5. Why didn't we play e5? And this ties into something I said yesterday, which is that, thank you, Coco Man, which is that controlling the center is not a race, and controlling the center happens in 2 ways. You control it with pawns and you control it with pieces. And when you first start playing chess, you're often taught to play these moves e4, d4, and e5, d5. But remember that when you control the center only with pawns and you don't bring your pieces out, it disrupts the balance, and those pawns can become themselves very vulnerable. As it's become a meme now. That's the nature of hypermodern openings, right? Hypermodern openings come from people who said, let's make our opponents push all their central pawns out so we can pick them off with our pieces. So what do I mean by this? Well, white can go knight f3. And in this specific instance, folks, this is fine for black because he's played so inefficiently. But I'm trying to illustrate the concept here. The concept is that he can very quickly start attacking our pawns, which would make it unnecessary for us to control all of the center. So the moral here is that it's much better to control less of the center, but do it in a way that keeps the pawns solid, than push all of our pawns to the 4th rank and, watch our pawns then crumble because we didn't develop enough pieces. All right. Well, if we push the pawn at e4, see, that's exactly the nature of the problem. We give him a beautiful square for his knight, and then he can play d3 and undermine this pawn. So another way to look at this is space doesn't win the game. A space advantage is something that you have to convert into something else. So just pushing pawns for the sake of grabbing space is something which you have to do very mindfully and very carefully. You have to understand why you're doing it. And particularly when you push pawns like this, you give up all of these squares for your opponent's pieces. I hope that makes sense. All right. So knight c6, 100 bits. Thank you, Ozzy. c3 is not good. He should have just developed. a6 now. And we're basically, because we have 5 minutes until the server restart, we're going to fast forward here. Everything I did here should be very clear. This, of course, was the key moment where I didn't take on d4. Let's check the computer. I'm actually very curious. Yeah, a5 is the best move. a5 and its other move is rook fc8, just bringing the rook into the game. Because given the way the game unfolded, it turns out that this pawn we're actually using to our advantage. We are using this pawn as a way to make this bishop very bad. He almost wants to take his own pawn so that this bishop can come out to a good square. So a5. Bishop d2 is a great move. We take it. And here I wanted to explain what other move I had in mind other than knight takes d4. So why do I want to open the queen side? It's less about opening the queen side and more about creating a specific weakness. More about creating a specific weakness. We've created a weakness. If he had taken on a5, then we would have created another weakness. And because my pieces are more active, the way that manifests itself, you might look at this and say, well, wait a second, you're also having a weakness on b7. Yes, strictly speaking, b7 is an isolated pawn, so it's a weakness. But because our pieces are more active, we are in a much better position to attack his weakness than he is to attack mine. Hope that makes sense. But with the A file being opened, I want to get control of the A file. And taking on A1 is not the way to do that, because that gives him control of the A file. How do we get control of the A file? This is a common technique. Yeah, we go rook A6. So we literally double rooks, which is not intuitive here because he's got a rook on A1. But we use the same principle. If he takes, then we take with a queen and we've won the battle. And if he doesn't do that, then we double on A8 and we will essentially force his rook away from A1, either to take our rook or to move away. All right? So that was also something which attracted me, but we decided not to overthink it, just to take the pawn, given that b4 is also weak. Boom, boom. Thank you, Ryan. And bishop takes b4. We could have also gone rook to a2. Yeah, so bishop c3 also probably would have been the best move, but now we can take on f3. And here's a good tactical question for you guys. Can we take on... Don't rush. Don't rush. Can we take on b4? I know what some of you are going to be thinking, but try to calculate as deeply as possible. Okay. The answer is yes, but those of you saying no, say rook b1. But remember, white has a weak back rank. If the rook disappears from b1, we have control of the a-file. We'll be able to play rook a1, so we can take his bishop. And if he says free queen, boom goes the dynamite, and he can cover with two of his pieces, but we'll take both of them, and that's back rank mate. No, that's fine. I mean, that's why I asked the question, right? And this skill, calculating deeply, is tied into two. It's a mindset shift. You have to sort of tell yourself, I'm going to calculate past that initial knee-jerk reaction. And the second thing is the importance of tactical observations. The way that I see this quickly is because I've already noticed beforehand that white is a weak back rank, so I'm keeping my eyes peeled. I also noticed that we have a rook on a8, which is poised to go to a1. That combination of two things helps my subconscious, and I'm not like literally telling myself this, but that's how pattern recognition works. Zesty Slav, thank you for the prime. All right. So, man, thanks for another cheer. So we decided he took, we take the pawn. Boom, boom. And yeah, so queen c3, we wanted to trade rooks, but he played a very nice move, king g2. Quasi, think of the prime. We got a hype train. After rook a1, just to explain, takes, queen c2. He threatens checkmate, and if we create luft, he actually wins the pawn on b7. This is very hard to win. So actually, if you're playing black and you're trying to defend against mate without giving up the pawn, you have only one move here. Gh6, think about the prime. Yeah, queen a8. Then we can put the queen behind the pawn and push this pawn. But what can white do in this position to prevent queen b8? This shows that endgames are all about piece activity. It's the side that has the most active pieces, which often has the best time. Queen c7 is correct. Right, and now we can't play queen b8, and if we push our pawn, white gets behind the passed pawn. This makes it very hard to push this pawn, and this will be hard to win. So that's the reason, in short, why I played it b5 first, then b4. Okay, he made it easy for us by trading queens. But let's fast forward. The server is restarting. I want to get this comment in before it does. A lot of you were thinking e5. What is the reason I delayed that move? Well, after takes, again, conceptually, this is the right idea. Because if he takes on b3, then our king is as close as possible to white's pawns, and we can just come in and take all of them. But in this position, white is a very annoying procedure, kind of, I think it's called changing of the guard, somebody called it. What piece is blockading the b pawn? Well, it's the rook. He can check us on e2. Normally, this move would be met with b2. Like, if he did that here, right, rook e2, we would have pushed the pawn to b2 and given up that pawn and forced the transition into a pawn game, which we want. But in this position, he does that with check. Our king has to move. Then he brings his king to b2. The bottom line is the rook is a stronger piece than the king. The rook is harder to take down. So this is completely winning. We can push our d-pawn, but this would have taken a lot longer, as you guys can understand, than a pawn game. Thank you, actually, Grace 95. Does that make sense? Why not king f6 instead of... Well, king f6 is fine, but I wanted to keep the king closer to the center. Who knows what can happen? You know, keeping the king on d6 sort of does two things at once. I'm still preparing e5, but I'm keeping the king close to my rook just in case. King f6 is fine. Also, king f6 blocks the f-pawn. So f6, f4, and now, why am I making this waiting move? Well, e5, it's the same problem. He takes everything, goes rook e2 and king b2. But he runs out of moves here. Because if he moves his king away from the pawn, then we play e5. And you guys might look at this and say, wait a second, this is the same thing. Boom, 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 rook e2. But wait a second, his king is stepped aside from c3, so he can't go king b2. King doesn't move like a knight. He has to bring his rook back to b2. And now we're grooving. But if he moves his rook back, then once again we go b2 and he's again in Zugzwang. So hopefully that makes sense. b2, and it's the same thing as happened in the game. That's all there is to it. This isn't particularly hard to, I think, follow, and now we just come in and win all the pawns. All right. That is basically the game. So it's a long game. Why didn't I play e5 before I played d4? Well, his pawn, if I'm not mistaken... Oh, no, his pawn was on d4 only recently. Okay, I get what you're saying. So I could have played e5 before d4, but I wasn't sure how I was going to win the game. Yeah, this was possible. But I was a little bit worried that his king would come in and start taking my pawns. You know, I didn't want to allow this. I wanted to bring my king in first. Okay? Doesn't matter... You could also win it with opposition at the end. Yes, you can win the final position, final endgame, by ignoring these pawns and winning this as you would a position without these pawns, so king d4. Because he's paralyzed, he doesn't have any pawn moves, so it's basically the same thing.